Funding for this program is provided by Aruba, one happy island. The Monaco Government Tourist Office. Hilton Head Island. Malta, the heart of the Mediterranean. Corinthia, craftsmanship of care. And Greater Williamsburg, Jamestown, Yorktown, and Williamsburg.
This week on The Travel Detective, think you're sailing on a brand new cruise ship? Well, you might want to think again. That ship may have sailed under different names and different companies for decades. We'll look at the notorious past lives of some cruise ships. That's in our cover story.
The only people that are missing anything are the people that don't know the history of the ship.
Plus, we discover the hidden gems of Beijing and how at least some of ancient China is being preserved.
No factory.
Not a single factory involved.
没有工厂 Nope.
Nope, I got the no part.
And what happens when an airline switches your seat? And how do you fight back?
I'm Peter Greenberg. Those stories and more in this week's edition of The Travel Detective. I'm standing in front of a brand new ship, the Norwegian Breakaway. New ship, new name. But let's define the word new, because it doesn't always apply to a ship that's promoted as new. Some of these ships have an amazing past, and some of them are quite bizarre.
We've all seen images of ship christenings. A champagne bottle smashed against the hull, and a brand new vessel launched into the sea. But what happens to that once new ship 5, 10, or 15 years later? In many cases, it's sold from one cruise line to another. It gets renamed and then reincarnated again and again, and often promoted as a new ship. Take the historic ship, the SS France.
$60 million craft will carry 2,000 passengers in air.
At the time of construction in 1960, she was the longest passenger ship ever built.
Super modern, with a very large tourist class and a very large first class, with the best food in the world. And she was so expensive to operate that she needed a subsidy from the French government.
On her maiden voyage, movie stars and aristocrats graced her decks. Salvador Dali was a frequent passenger. And when David Bowie sailed on the France, he gave an impromptu performance for the crew. She once even transported the Mona Lisa to New York for an American tour. But then came the jet age and supersonic transatlantic airline crossings. And when fuel prices rose, the SS France and many other liners simply became too expensive to sail.
She was too big to be a cruise ship at the time. Cruise ships were maybe a fifth the size, the typical cruise ship of that era. But NCL came along, bought the ship, completely rebuilt her for warm weather cruising, made the cabins much larger, and they renamed her SS Norway, and she became a smash.
The Norway sailed the Caribbean as a mass-market cruise ship for another 2 decades. But time took its toll. In a state of growing disrepair, the once grand ocean liner was given a surprise inspection by the U.S. Coast Guard, which found more than 100 safety violations. The ship was immediately grounded, but then the cruise line made a deal. If the company fixed most of the major violations, it asked the Coast Guard to let it continue to sail. In return, the cruise line promised to sail the ship out of U.S. waters permanently and to never return by the end of September 2001. But then came 9/11, and the world's attention went elsewhere. The Norway continued to sail out of Florida, and then, less than 2 years later, while sitting at the port in Miami, some of the violations came home to roost.
A deadly boiler explosion aboard a cruise ship in Miami. The SS Norway had just docked yesterday.
A massive boiler explosion aboard the ship killed 8 crew members.
deferred maintenance, and everybody thinking it'll be fine, and then this awful explosion. It just would have been too costly to rebuild the ship and bring her back into service. So they offered her for sale, and the only people that came along with money were the shipbreakers in India.
And it had another name yet again.
Yes, Blue Lady, which was her nickname when she sailed as the Norway because she had a beautiful coat of blue on her hull. So she was affectionately called the Blue Lady, but in the end it ended up being a very sad, it's a name that people now think of negatively because that's what she was called when she sat on that beach in India being torn to shreds.
It was a sad end to a ship that once set the standard for ocean liner elegance.
It's fascinating to me that, there's always that story that it's bad luck to rename a ship.
I think it's myths because some ships have had many, many lives and never had an incident, and then others have had only one name, Titanic, for instance, and had terrible luck. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Old ships are fine as long as they're maintained properly.
And old ships tell stories.
Absolutely.
It's one thing to rename an old ship and sail it again for paying passengers, but sometimes a renamed cruise ship finds a wildly different purpose.
This ship, it's now called the Free Winds. A typical cruise ship? Hardly. It's had quite a history.
The ship was first built more than 47 years ago and named the Bohème. It was one of the first modern cruise ships to be based in the port of Miami for year-round cruise service, a pioneer, in fact, for sea trips to the Caribbean. But in 1986, she was quietly sold to new owners and renamed the Free Winds. But you can't buy a cabin on this ship. Its passengers have to be invited. The owners? The Church of Scientology. And where it goes and what it does remains a closely guarded secret. In the cruise industry, part of the mythology is about romance at sea. And part of the history is about the stories that are hardly ever told about these resurrected ghost ships.
You won't find Gate 13 at Las Vegas International Airport. No one wants to jinx their luck there. The same holds true at many airports around the world. Aviation and travel are filled with superstitions. Most travelers know flying statistically is safer than driving, but there's still unease for many passengers when metal machines defy gravity. Flight attendants greeting passengers at the front of planes say they observe all kinds of superstitious habits, from tapping and kissing the plane to jigs and dances in the jetway. People do it once and the flight gets there safely, so they figure they better keep doing it, right? Most airlines say they never use 13 and 911 for flight numbers, and tradition holds that the flight numbers of crash planes are never used again. Both American Airlines and Delta Airlines have suffered crashes of Flight 191, and neither use that number anymore. Of 102 airlines tracked by SeatGuru.com, 25 around the world have no row 13 on their planes. There are exceptions to superstitions, of course. Here at Dallas Love Field, you will find Gate 13. If you happen to be superstitious and flying out of this gate, you just gotta go with it. To promote good luck, Southwest Airlines has Flight 711 to Las Vegas, and other airlines put lucky numbers on Vegas flights too. In addition to Flight 13, most airlines avoid using 666, the biblical number of the beast. But Finnair goes the other way and seemingly tempts fate with one of its flights to Helsinki. The flight from Copenhagen has been operating for years as Flight 666. And since the airport code for Helsinki is HEL, well, you guessed it, it's Flight 666 to hell. I'm Scott McCartney for The Travel Detective.
When it comes to flying, you already know that the two most dangerous moments are takeoff and landing. Wind, poor visibility, even obstacles on the ground can all make navigating that runway especially tricky. But not every airport is created equal. It turns out that some are a little more frightening than others. Take the tiny airport on the Caribbean island of Saba. The runway is perched right on a cliff and drops directly into the sea at both ends. On top of that, it's a measly 1,300 feet long, the shortest commercial runway in the world, so there's no room for error here. Or how about the Tenzing Hillary Airport in Nepal? This is usually the first stop for folks attempting to climb Mount Everest. And yes, it's pretty high up, more than 9,000 feet above sea level. And the high winds and unpredictable visibility make this runway one of the most dangerous in the world. It also doesn't help that it has a 12-degree incline and ends with a 2,000-foot drop into the valley below. Hold on tight. And finally, there's Princess Juliana Airport in St. Martin. The runway here is long enough to handle huge jetliners, but just barely. In fact, in order to land safely, planes have to come in incredibly low over the water. So low, in fact, that sunbathers on the beach can almost reach up and touch them if they're not blown away at the same time. How's that for an adrenaline rush? Bon voyage.
When you think about Beijing, of course you think about the iconic places like Tiananmen Square, the Forbidden City, and the Great Wall. But it's not a question of whether you're going to see them. It's a question of how and when. It's all about the finesse. So let me show you my hidden gems of Beijing.
With a population that tops 20 million and a history that stretches back more than 3,000 years, when you visit Beijing, it's really not the time to pull out the guidebook. You've got to hit the street.
If you're looking to see Beijing in a very special way, and I mean a really special way, I'm not talking about a tour bus or some kind of guided tour. It's this way. It's by sidecar. Hey, all right. And away we go.
Beijing has nearly 3,000 miles of roads, and they're usually packed with cars. So riding in one of these is a great way to cut through all that traffic.
It only costs about $250 for 2 people for 2 hours. You can't see Beijing any better than this. None of that. Feels pretty cool, too.
Many of the old streets in Beijing are no wider than a small alley. They're called hutongs, and it's back in here that the real heart of the city is pulsing.
Oh, yeah, look at the meat. Look at the meat. Wow. You got eggs. Got meat. Got fruit. Pretty cool.
And there are plenty of hidden treasures, if you know where to look.
Wait, and this door was owned by a military, a soldier. By the size of it, you can see they were officers, quite high-ranking.
Not a bad way to get your first taste of a city as sprawling as this one.
All right.
As we all know, China sells a huge amount of stuff to the rest of the world. And let's be honest, a lot of it is junk. But there are exceptions, and you can sometimes find them in the unlikeliest of places.
If you're looking for some really cool shopping, avoid the malls and avoid the cars. The traffic's terrible. Head out to the embassy area on Sunlichuan Road. Take a bike, but don't go too fast because you might miss it. Now get off the bike, and here it is. It's called Phoenix Handmade Porcelain. You know what? Not in the brochure, not in the guidebook, but it's in my book. You gotta stop.
Porcelain originated in China thousands of years ago, and the intricate designs and beautiful glazing work can still be found in small shops like these. My translator Mei Zhang knows the city better than most.
Mr. Ray.
Nice to
Peter.
meet you.
Peter's
This is all her stuff.
This is all her stuff, her design.
Yeah.
And she actually does a lot of the molds herself. And so she's one of the artists who really sticks to the sort of
Traditional.
hand-making tradition. Yeah, not machines.
No factory.
No factory.
Not a single factory involved.
没有工厂. Nope.
Nope, I got the no part.
And I feel sometimes when you go to stores in China, everything's like factory made and then things are cheap. That's what Made in China is sort of stands for. It's so rare to find a jewel, an artisan who loves doing what she does.
And you can see that passion and craftsmanship on display in every piece of porcelain.
She loves this sort of subtle green color because the style of this actually has lasted since Tang Dynasty, which is, what, 1,200 years ago? And she basically did her own design adopting traditional technique and make it still functional in modern days.
So what we really have here is traditional and original.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
Just like this porcelain shop, there are surprises around nearly every corner in Beijing, especially when it comes to the food. Take this Vietnamese restaurant called Susu. Wait a minute, Vietnamese food in China? Of course, it's like finding great Italian food in the middle of Lucerne. But the challenge with Susu is, first, you have to get here.
Don't look for signs, and there are no street numbers. If you want to find this place, you count your steps. When you get 300 meters, you turn right, and you go through these doors. And then, you're in for a real surprise. You're hard to find.
For us, I think that is the thing. We want to create some experience. And later on, we said, oh, should we get a sign or should we give the very detailed map? And I think, people love to make an adventure, right?
And don't be fooled by the size of the place.
This is one tiny kitchen, isn't it?
Very tiny. We have to squeeze everything in, so very tight.
And squeeze it in, they do. Susu serves about 200 customers a day, and they keep coming back for more.
And what makes this food, what makes it so special?
I think our chefs are artists. They can just, work out such beautiful dishes, with a tiny little space. This is the classic pancake.
And what's
we
in
call
this?
The basil.
It's called the what now?
The shrimp and pork. Now, this is the beans, the yellow beans, and this is the flour made of this beans.
So it's Vietnamese, but also quite French.
I think they borrowed some, like a concept.
They did?
Yeah. They mix.
No, they didn't borrow it, they stole it.
They shouldn't say that, it's including.
Well, whoever came up with the idea, it sure tastes good. Not surprisingly, most first-time tourists to Beijing go to the Great Wall. Parts of this ancient fortification run through the mountains just north of the city, and it's definitely a sight to behold. But once you're there, stick around. You'll be in for a treat.
Most people go to the Great Wall and then go back to their hotel in Beijing. I've got a better idea. End your day at the base of the Great Wall in the village of Bago, at a place called the Brickyard Retreat, a 25-room special place that most people don't even know about.
Jim Spear owns the Brickyard with his wife. He's an American expat, but he's no newcomer to China.
I've lived here for 29 years, and I first came here as a student at Beijing University in 1981. I've seen a lot of changes over the years, and for the most part, I think the change would count as progress.
And it turns out, Jim has actually been a part of that progress. He opened the Brickyard several years ago, after he and his wife stumbled on an old factory building outside Beijing.
Which was a smoke-belching glazed tile factory, full of heaps and mess. And I turned around and there was this incredibly stunning view of the Great Wall. And then I started to think and imagine what an opportunity to take something which had been polluting and ruining the environment out here in the countryside and turn it into something that could hire local people, where we could build a garden and grow some of our own food, and then have people from China and from overseas come in and be able to enjoy the scenery here.
Visitors to the Brickyard also get a real taste and feel of the Chinese countryside.
You cannot help but be immersed. Just next door are where local Chinese villagers live. Beijing and Shanghai, so advanced, so modern. That's the real China. But at the same time, there's something like 600,000 villages in the country. And that's part of the real China, too.
But don't worry, here the beds are comfy, and they serve up a mean cup of tea.
I've gotten wonderful feedback from people. They would never expect to find a little hotel like this in the countryside in China.
Like so much of Beijing, the key to these hidden gems is finding them in the first place. That's also part of the charm.
Now I know what some of you think about airline food. You don't eat it because you're hungry, you eat it because you're bored, or you just don't like it. But believe it or not, there is a science to airline food right here in these flight kitchens. They finally figured out not only what you like to eat, but why you like to eat it. And the facts might surprise you.
Despite what you may think, there was never really a golden age of airline food. It's always had a bad reputation, dry, spongy, and just plain bland. But it turns out the main reason for that isn't the food, it's us. Sinead Ferguson is the menu design manager for British Airways.
When people think about airline food, some people who are a little snarky might think the words airline food is an oxymoron. You guys have taken it to a science.
Absolutely. We've done a huge amount of work over the last 18 months on what happens to your taste at altitude. And typically, you lose 33% of your ability to taste at altitude.
Every time you fly, the effect on your taste buds is similar to having a cold. The pressurized cabin, the colder air, and the extreme dryness make your taste buds go numb, and you simply can't experience all the flavors in the food you eat. But food scientists in the airline industry have recently learned how to compensate for that by serving dishes that are rich in umami.
So umami is a really savory taste, and it's found naturally in ingredients such as parmesan, mushrooms, tomatoes, certain fish, seaweed, and we try and incorporate a lot of those ingredients in our food.
Umami-rich meals have a much more robust flavor profile, especially at 35,000 feet.
Certain cheeses will work really well at altitude. Goat's cheese works really well. You really get that sort of strong, intense flavor come through.
A similar flavor effect can be achieved with spicy foods.
Quite highly spiced foods work really well at altitude. So wherever British Airways serve a curry, be it in the front of the cabin or the back of the cabin, it's really, really popular. We have some mango chutney, wonderful spiced nutty lentils.
You know what? It really is a completely different take on airplane food.
For sure.
And nobody does umami like she do.
But taste isn't the only thing airlines have to contend with.
Because of the humidity in the cabin, you lose...
Or the lack of it.
Or the lack of it, you lose a lot of moisture. If you had a packaged sandwich and you open that, you immediately feel how dry that bread has become.
But because of that lack of humidity, you have to go into every meal realizing you almost have to do double the amount of moisture.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a very fine line between destroying it and between getting it right.
That's especially true when it comes to one of the biggest challenges in serving food on a plane.
What most people don't realize is airline food is by definition cooked twice.
Yeah, that's correct. We have to give our crew specific guidelines on how to reheat those dishes. If you have, say, a beef dish, it will be steamed for X amount of minutes. So, you know, the technology is there and it's evolving all the time.
But sometimes, after running all those tests on taste buds and humidity levels, that evolution comes full circle, right back to the familiar.
Bangers and mash.
Bangers and mash is so popular. It's amazing. It is such a great meal. We've served sausages and mash in first class, right through to club, right through to World Traveller. And, you know, you can get amazing sausages, so it's a really premium product. And it's comfort food.
While fancy meals might be good on the ground, there's a million ways they can go wrong in the air. The best recipe is often just the least complicated.
All the science in the world can't take precedence over the one essential ingredient you gotta have with airline food, keeping it just simple. Look at this. Smoked salmon, little creme fraiche. It'll beat that mystery Salisbury steak any day of the week. So what kind of airline seat do you want the next time you fly? Let me make a crazy guess. You probably don't want the dreaded middle seat. All right, so far so good. So how do you get the seat you want? Well, most of you go online to look at the airline seating chart, and that's where you make your first mistake. Why? Because more often than not, the seats that they're showing available on that chart are, guess what? The dreaded middle seat. So what do? I know, perish the thought. I'm going to suggest you actually talk to a human being. Call the airline. Why? Because what they're showing you on the chart doesn't reflect their full inventory. They hold back about 30% of those seats. Talk to a human being, get the aisle or window. Because if you don't, you're going to get caught in that dreaded upsell game. They want you to pony up to move to the front of the cabin and coach. They even define a middle seat in coach as a premium seat. How ridiculous is that? Making that phone call is actually your best bet. It gives you the best chance of getting the window or the aisle. Otherwise, hey, you're sitting where I am. That about does it for this week. I'll see you next time on another edition of The Travel Detective.
Funding for this program is provided by Aruba, one happy island. The Monaco Government Tourist Office. Hilton Head Island. Malta, the heart of the Mediterranean. Corinthia, craftsmanship of care. And Greater Williamsburg, Jamestown, Yorktown, and Williamsburg.